Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio. Thank you for joining me this evening for Dharma Sunday, where we take canonical Buddhist teachings and tie them with everyday life. The title of today's talk is A Buddhist Reflects on Squid Game. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. So my mentions have been filled recently with talk about a new show on Netflix, or series I should say, called Squid Game. It comes to us from Korea, and essentially it's in the battle royale genre, which means you get a bunch of people in one place and they kill each other in some very grotesque ways. And there's always a game involved. There was a show or a movie several years ago literally called Battle Royale. And they had a few sequels where it was essentially high school students, if I remember correctly, and they were put on an island and everyone was given an object, a frying pan, a baseball bat, whatever, and they kill each other. So Squid Game falls into that genre. There's a little bit more to it. It is a critique on classism and capitalism as it affects our world. So there are some philosophical undertones as well. But I thought because it's so popular and because everyone is talking about it, it'd be the good subject for a Dharma talk. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to do that first by reading this article from the Brown Daily Herald, Website is browndailyherald.com. It's an opinion piece written by Bliss Han, and it's entitled Han 23, Why Didn't I Love Squid Game? So, let's get into it. It was a Friday night. I was in a familiar state, too tired to go out, too awake to go to sleep, and far too lazy to get a head start on my readings for next week. Right then, my phone flashed with a notification from Netflix. Something called Squid Game had just been released. The description read, hundreds of cash-strapped players accept a strange invitation to compete in children's games. Inside, a tempting prize awaits, with deadly high stakes. It looked interesting, or at least interesting enough to put on in the background as I worked my way through a congested email inbox and folded my laundry. Moreover, I didn't have anything better to do, which was as good of a reason to watch Netflix as any. With an internal shrug, I pressed play. Now, according to Netflix, 111 million accounts have viewed Squid Game since it was released on September 17th, making it the streaming giant's biggest ever series at launch. It also reached the top of Netflix's top 10 list in 94 countries, including in South Korea, the show's home market, and in the United States, becoming the first ever Korean series to do so. And of course, the show has been a huge hit on the internet, spawning a million viral memes and somehow making tracksuits hot. In fact, Squid Game has become so big that the North Korean government has seized upon the show's portrayal of the dog-eat-dog nature of capitalism as reflective of the reality of the beastly nature of South Korea's society. It has also garnered a mostly positive critical response, with a 91% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Squid Game is big, addictive, and generally considered to be pretty good. What's to dislike? My initial reaction was that Squid Game was a fun but ultimately unremarkable and unmemorable Friday night watch. But as the internet fervor around Squid Game grew, I found myself less and less enthusiastic about it. I increasingly felt a sinking suspicion that the booming popularity of the show would give rise to cultural misinterpretation and in turn, appropriation. While the series was entertaining, many aspects of it didn't particularly appeal to me. First, the show relies heavily on graphic violence, where it could have used this violence to construct an original view of the growing inequality, debt, and class strife in South Korea and abroad. Squid Game uses gore to serve as nothing more than an admittedly effective shock factor. As the New York Times television critic Mike Hale put it, it's just empty, bloody calories. The series director, Wang Dong-yuk, said the show is not just a critique of the brutality of capitalism, but also of our penchant for consuming others' humiliation and struggles to survive as entertainment. But if it relies on gratuitous violence to draw eyeballs, is Squid Game all that different from the kinds of entertainment that Wong is trying to critique? More broadly, graphic violence seems to be the common thread among many of Netflix's most successful Korean language series, including not only Squid Game, but also Kingdom and Sweet Home. Identifying this running theme led me to wonder if a Korean show that has something smart to say could find international commercial success without relying on gore. But once the shock of the gore pulls you in, Squid Game fails to bring a novel perspective to its well-trodden themes. Korean cinema and television have long focused on the impacts of income inequality, and many longtime watchers, including myself, came away from Squid Game without thinking that added anything particularly novel to the cultural arena. Anyone who has watched a lot of Korean movies and TV will note that Squid Game relies on tired tropes that invoke a capitalist dystopia to critique income inequality. As one Korean critic remarked, too much in Squid Game reminds you of every other movie you've ever seen. Okay, so it goes on a little bit after that, but I think you get the general idea. If you'd like to read the entire article, again, it's at browndailyherald.com, and the title is Han 23, Why Didn't I Love Squid Game? Now, the question that most people are probably expecting me to answer is, should Buddhists watch Squid Game? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. I'm not your parent. It's not my job to tell you what to do. However, I did watch 1.5 episodes of Squid Game. That's about all I could get through. So I have some opinions. And I want to share those with you today, but I want to make it clear that my job and my intention is not to say, well, people who watch this show are bad, or people who do watch this show are good, or anything of that nature. I just want to share some thoughts I had while watching the show, watching other shows like it, and then what the Dharma can do to inform us when we're choosing things to watch in the cultural diaspora. So, first off, we have to establish something, and that is that as Buddhist practitioners, we have 3 goals. And what are those goals? We want to end suffering for ourselves and others. We want to realize enlightenment, which is the full manifestation of our Buddha nature in daily life. And we want to attain nirvana, which is usually described and understood as inner peace. So those are our 3 goals in Buddhism. We want inner peace, we want enlightenment, and we want to end suffering for ourselves and other people. So when we're making decisions in the world, whether it's what shows to watch, or how to speak to our neighbor, or what job to take, those are some guideposts that we can use. Now, you'll notice there's a lot of play and wiggle room there. So the goal isn't to say do this or don't do that. They're simply measuring sticks. And they go all the way back to the Buddha when he sat under the Bodhi tree and said, I will not move from this spot until I found a way to end suffering for all beings. Actually, I think the more exact quote was, I found a way to end all sorrow. But you get the idea. The goal of the Buddha when he sat under the Bodhi tree and realized enlightenment was to end suffering, to end sorrow for himself and others. So that's the kind of the mindset we have to have when we're going through the world. And that seems very logical, very reasonable, very duh. But it's not. And it's not because we as human beings are drunk on desire. All of us. And it doesn't make us bad people. That's simply the nature of having a human body. We have greed, we have anger, we have ignorance. These are the 3 poisons in Buddhism, and they cloud our judgment. In the Nirvana Sutra, the description that's used is that we are drunk. We're like a drunk man who's so inebriated that he can't even recognize his own mother and his own sister. That's the description used in the Nirvana Sutra. And that's how we live our lives. We're so drunk on desire, so drunk on greed, so drunk on anger, so drunk on ignorance, that we can't see the world in front of us clearly. And we make decisions that aren't always healthy as a result. Just as a sort of a very simple one, chocolate cake. Chocolate cake is delicious. People like chocolate cake. And it's very unhealthy for us. But we like the taste so much that we eat it anyway. Even though we know that carrots would probably be a better choice. But there's a reason people don't serve carrots at parties. Because we like cake. Because again, we are drunk on the mind of desire. Exercise. Everyone tells us we should get 30 minutes of exercise 3 times a week. Everyone knows this. Even if we're not athletes, everyone's heard this at least once. But it's a lot easier, it's a lot more pleasurable, it's a lot more fun. It fulfills our desires more readily if we pick up the remote and we turn on the TV and we veg out for those 30 minutes on our favorite show. Again, doesn't make us bad people. It's just the nature of our lives in samsara. That's why the first noble truth of Buddhism, before he talks about meditation and mindfulness, before he even talks about morality, the first noble truth of Buddhism is right view. Seeing the world clearly. Understanding what causes suffering, what doesn't cause suffering. Learning to avoid the former and engage in the latter. That is our practice. So how do we do that? How do we engage in the world that ends suffering for ourselves and others? How do we practice right view? Well, in the Buddhist world, we think of our minds as a garden. And the way we realize the goals I mentioned earlier, enlightenment, nirvana, the end of suffering, is through the training and cultivation of our minds. So if you think of your mind as a garden bed, if it's very carefully cultivated, you can grow wonderful food in it. You can grow potatoes, you can grow carrots, you can grow broccoli, beans. If you don't cultivate the garden, it's not going to lie there barren. Something is going to grow there. It's going to be weeds. It's going to be grass. It's going to be brambles. It's going to be stuff you don't want. So the question isn't, should we or should we not cultivate our garden, our mind garden? The question is, are we going to do the cultivation? Or is the world going to do the cultivation for us? Are we going to be very intentional about what goes into the garden beds of our minds so that we're growing the things we want to grow? Namely wisdom, namely compassion, namely care for our fellow sentient beings? Or are we going to let the beds lay fallow until other people who don't care about us, don't care about our minds, just start throwing things in? Vasubandhu, who was an Indian Buddhist monk in the 4th century, talked a lot about this in his 30 verses. That the entire world is mind only, nothing but mental transformations. Manifestations of karmic seeds coming from the storehouse consciousness. And our goal, our work as Buddhists, is recognizing the negative karmic seeds, stopping them from manifesting. So greed, anger, ignorance comes up in our minds and we don't act on it. But then also purposely planting seeds of charity, of humility, of generosity. This is what we do in a traditional Buddhist liturgy, right? The bowing, the chanting, the meditation, the sutra study. We're not just doing that because it's tradition or because it looks cool. We're doing that because when we step in front of the altar and we make an offering, we plant a seed of generosity in our minds. And that generosity will grow in our minds later on. When we sit on the cushion and practice meditation, we are planting the seed of equanimity in our minds. And as we sit in meditation, if we practice equanimity, that seed will grow not just in the meditation room, but later on in our lives. And that's all our practice is, all of it. The meditation, the chanting, the sutra study, as complex and as intricate as the philosophy can be. And I love the philosophy of Buddhism. It is very simply not engaging in practices that cause harm, and then engaging in practices that are helpful and beneficial. Very simple, but like I said, very difficult because, again, we have the mind of desire. So the Buddha, in his day, had some very strict rules for his monastics because he wanted to help them cultivate their minds. If you read the original Vinaya, it has rules in it like they weren't allowed to go into dancing halls. They weren't allowed to listen to music. Not because dancing or listening to music are evil things. I listen to music every day. But because what we're listening to stirs up our minds. It plants seeds, right? And because they were devoting 100% of their time to their practice, they didn't want to stir up any seeds. They wanted to keep their minds as calm and as peaceful as possible. And dancing, there's nothing wrong with dancing, but dancing stirs up the mind. Listening to music, nothing wrong with listening to music, but it stirs up the mind. Now that said, as lay practitioners, most of the people watching this aren't going to stop going to dance halls, aren't going to stop listening to music, aren't going to stop watching movies on Netflix. And you don't need to do that to practice Buddhism. But it does mean that we need to be very careful and very intentional about what we choose to engage with in the media. And again, it is not my job to tell you what you should and shouldn't do, should and shouldn't watch. I'm simply giving you information, giving you tools so that you can make that decision for yourself. Now, that said, I did watch a couple episodes of Squid Game, and some things did jump out at me. And I agree with a lot of what was said in the article. I think it was very good storytelling. There was also a lot of violence, gratuitous violence at times. There's a scene, spoiler alert, where someone is having their organs harvested, and you see that. And I'm not sure that was necessary for the story. I'm pretty sure it was just there for shock value, right? So this is a situation where we're trying to learn something, I'd assume, but is this the best medium for us to do it? Now, I personally feel like there are other movies that tell us about the difficulties of classism and the dangers of capitalism in a better way. Parasite was quite good and didn't rely so much on the gratuitous violence. That said, Squid Game is out there. And the problem I had while I was watching Squid Game is it reminded me a lot of another show that I watched way back when called Game of Thrones. Maybe you heard of it. And I watched all the seasons of Game of Thrones, including the last one, which was completely terrible. And it was only after I watched Game of Thrones that I really started to think about what did I actually watch? And what did it do to my mind? And how was I thinking about people as a result of watching the show? Did this help me think of people as Buddhas, as sacred objects that we should venerate? Or was I thinking of them as props for my entertainment? And frankly, with Game of Thrones, I came away thinking the latter. I found myself justifying things that I really shouldn't have been justifying, and you may want to skip over this part if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, but there's something called the Red Wedding, where a lot of people get stabbed and killed in horrible ways, and it was a shock factor thing. I mean, clearly this was meant to pull us into the story and get likes and views on Twitter. And in my mind, instead of seeing all these people be murdered and think, oh, that's terrible, I was thinking, well, maybe he should have just married that girl. Maybe he should have just kept his promise. Almost justifying the massacre that I was seeing on TV. And again, I'm going to keep saying this because I want it to be clear. I'm not saying anyone who watched Game of Thrones is a bad person. I watched Game of Thrones. I'm just describing what media can do to our minds if we're not careful. And that wasn't a mindset that I wanted to engage with. That's not something that that's not a seed I want to plant in my head, that, sometimes it's okay to massacre people. So, the prequel is coming out for Game of Thrones, and I've decided I'm not going to watch that. Other people can make their own decisions. And when it comes to Squid Game, like I said, there are some interesting political and philosophical undertones in terms of our capitalist system using people as objects, as things, nothing but the sum of their parts, and what's it like to live in capitalism and have to fight, literally in some cases, for survival. But I feel like there are other shows that tell that exact same story, give that exact same message without the gratuitous violence. And again, I only watched a couple episodes, but I did not like the seeds that were being planted in my mind. I felt like I was starting to see the people as objects again. I found myself justifying things. Well, if that guy wasn't such a bully, he wouldn't have died that way. So, Squid Game is something I personally have decided not to engage with for that reason. And I think it says something about our society that increasingly the shows that become the most popular, whether it's Squid Game, whether it's Game of Thrones, are the ones that treat people in the most terrible, most grotesque ways. And I think it says something about the fact that we, as Buddhist practitioners, have to take responsibility for our own minds. Because Netflix is not going to do it. The Game of Thrones showrunners are not going to do it. We have to decide what we want going on in our heads. And we have to look at how that plays out in our daily life. So, that said, what should you do if you do decide to watch Squid Game? Knowing that this is going to stir up my mind, but hey, I want to see what the fuss is all about. Well, we can still, I don't want to say undo the damage, but there are ways in Buddhism that we can calm our minds and rebuild those minds of wisdom and compassion after we've been exposed to something that doesn't help in that way. In the same way that you can exercise and burn off the calories from a chocolate cake, you can practice Buddhism and work out the things that get planted in your mind by the media. One of the best things is sutra study. So if we're going to watch Squid Game, knowing what it's probably going to do to our minds, well, maybe afterwards you spend 10 or 15 minutes and you read a sutra. Study the Buddha's words, study his doctrine, counteract the seeds that were planted in your mind by the media by planting your own seeds of wisdom and compassion, courtesy of the Buddha, courtesy of the patriarchs and the matriarchs that came before us. Metta meditation is another excellent thing that we can do after our minds have been stirred up in order to rebuild that mind of wisdom and compassion. So after we watch a show like Game of Thrones, like Squid Game, and we're thinking of people as things and not as Buddhas that should be venerated and honored, so that in doing so we can see the Buddha within ourselves as also worthy of veneration and honor, well, metta meditation. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you be loved. Reciting that mantra to ourselves, even if it's only for 5 minutes, can help rebuild that mind of humility and generosity that we try to cultivate as Buddhists. So I've been walking a very fine line here. Like I said, again, it's not my job to tell anyone what to do or what not to do. I simply wanted to share the Dharma, share some things we should think about, not only with Squid Game, but regarding media in general, because the fact is we live in a world that increasingly is working for our destruction, and it's on us as practitioners to counteract that with our spiritual practice. And I've given you some tools. If you choose to engage in various types of media, well, this is how we can counteract it. So, I leave it to you to make a decision about what you want to do. I wish you well either way. You have your own inner wisdom and you can make your own call. Amitabha. So, that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. Just a few announcements. So this is Dharma Sunday. We do it every Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's when the This is broadcast, and I take canonical Buddhist teachings and I tie them with everyday life. So I talk about movies, the news, pop culture, and offer some Buddhist teachings that can help to interact with those things. On Wednesdays, we do meditation and sutra study, which is a bit more involved. That's a 15-minute guided meditation, a reading from a Buddhist scripture, followed by a Dharma talk. So, if you'd like to join us for that, I'd love to have you there. I hope to see you there. Amitabha.